Hello everyone, welcome to the first episode of Science Out East. I'm Karl Smith, I'm the Head of Research Excellence at the University of East London and your host today. So, in this podcast, we're going to explore different science projects happening in East London. We believe that science is for everyone and everywhere, from culture and sport to technology and healthcare. So in this very first episode of Science Out East, we will be discussing the impact of cities in raising children. We'll be looking to understand better the concepts of stress, noise, and other, let's say, urban environmental factors. And really, we're looking to gain practical ways for how we can support our urban communities. So I'm delighted to introduce my two special guests. They are Kate Farmer and Sam Voss. Kate, can you introduce yourself, please?
Sure, thanks, Karl. So my name is Kate Farmer and I'm an educational psychologist. And so educational psychologists work with children and young people, their families and their education professionals to think about how we can support children's learning and development and their well-being, and also to identify any barriers that there might be to children making progress, and then to help the adults in their lives to think about ways in which those barriers might be overcome. And educational psychologists work with children and young people from the age of 0 up to the age of 25 years, but I've mostly worked with children in the early years, so that's in the 0 to 5 age range, which is what brings me here today.
Fantastic. And Sam, before we dive into the questions, can you a short introduction to yourself as well, please?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Sam. So I'm a professor in the Department of Psychology here at UEL. And we run a wide variety of different taxpayer-funded research projects looking at these themes that we're going to be talking about today. So early environments and how they affect early child development. We're running a big longitudinal project funded at the moment by the European Research Council, where we're tracking babies through from early in development, from 5 months across a series of assessments through to kind of 36 months, round about the age when they start school. And we're putting little microphones and little stress monitors onto them and onto their parents. And we're recording kind of a day in the life snapshot of everything that they experience and how that affects their stress in order to look at kind of this key difference that we're going to be talking about today, which is how early life environments affect early development. The reason that we're doing it here is East London is this amazing melting pot where you get this amazing variety of different kind of living environments. There's a lot of kind of extreme wealth and a lot of quite extreme socioeconomic underprivilege, all in a really, really tight geographical area. So that's why kind of what we're going to be talking about today. We also do quite a lot of work with local schools. So more recently funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, we've been using the same techniques. So the same kind of wearable microphones, wearable cameras, wearable stress monitors, and putting them onto children in reception classrooms, so looking at how different types of educational setting affect children. So most of what we do is basic science research. So these funders fund us to find out the answers to questions that we don't know the answer to. So a lot of the stuff about how early environments affect children are just questions that nobody knows the answer to, so we get funding to find out the answers. But obviously a large part of my job now as a scientist is to make sure that the stuff that we discover is useful and the stuff that we discover reaches people. So that's why relationships with Kate and her colleagues are absolutely crucial, because we really do think that the stuff that we're finding out is important and has a material impact on understanding things like how we teach children, how we interact with children in educational settings. So that's what we're going to be talking about today.
Fantastic. And I'd just like to hear a bit more, actually, Kate, because we've heard a lot about Sam's research, which obviously has a strong academic underpinning, but obviously very real world and very practice oriented. So how did you as a practitioner get involved in working with Sam and his research?
So educational psychology, we describe ourselves as being an evidence-based profession. And so what that means is that all of the advice that we give to families or to educational professionals in helping them to think about how best to support children's learning and development must be underpinned by research. And so it's really, really important for us to engage with researchers like Sam, to hear about the latest research relating to children's learning and development, and then to think about what this means for our practice and how we can help them, parents and education professionals, to apply this in real world settings. And I think particularly the sensory environment is something which we really think about quite a lot when thinking about young children's learning and development, because young children use their senses as their very first way of finding out about the world around them. And so we need to think about how they're experiencing the sensory world when we're planning those learning opportunities. And as an educational psychologist, I work with children with special educational needs. And some of those children, so for example, children maybe with autism, they may have some differences in the way in which they process sensory information. So this means that some children can be perhaps oversensitive to particular sensory stimuli, whilst other children can be undersensitive. And this may cause them perhaps to maybe seek certain sensory experiences or to avoid certain sensory experiences. So, for example, some children can be very sensitive to sounds, and therefore they can find noisy and stimulating environments a really stressful place to be. And that can then impact upon their readiness to learn, but it can also impact upon their stress levels and their emotional regulation too. So it's really important for us in our profession to be thinking about engaging them with researchers like Sam to think about how some of the things that we're noticing that are impacting upon our children's learning and development, how best can we then support those things in the natural environment, in their home settings and in their education settings too.
Great. And that's a really good insight, I think, into the vital role that the environment plays in informing a child's development. But key things that came up there were the concepts of stress and noise. Sam, are you able just to elaborate a bit more what we mean by stress and noise in the context of a early years developmental environment?
So stress is both something that happens in our bodies and something that happens in our minds. Obviously, when we're measuring it in young children, so we work, as I was saying earlier, down to really early babies, so down to kind of 5-month-olds. We can't be asking a 5-month-old to tell us how they're feeling, but we can measure these same things that are happening in their body. And basically what we're measuring in their body is kind of what the state that they're in. So, and really, really coarsely put, we've got two states. We've got a fight or flight stress state and a rest and digest stress state. And the fight or flight is all about actually physically readying ourselves to fight or flight. So, our heart starts to beat faster. We start to sweat because we're expecting that to cool down. Kind of our stomach starts releasing a lot of glucose kind of into our muscles and that type of thing. And as I say, these are all adaptations that have evolved to actually kind of fight or flight. And rest or digest is basically the opposite. So all of those kind of short-term kind of energy maximizing kind of functions shut down, and we concentrate on long-term things like digesting our food. So we've evolved this way over, tens of thousands of years, because for most of our development as a species, life has been quite dangerous. And we actually quite regularly had to, fight, run for our lives. And we actually quite regularly had to chase after our food when we wanted to eat it. Nowadays, luckily, we're in a state as a species where we very rarely have to do that. I don't have to chase after my food. I just have to go down to Tesco's and buy it kind of neatly wrapped in a plastic package. But this idea of these two stress systems is still everything that we have as a way of coping with threatening situations. So what people nowadays recognize as a sign of psychological danger, something like I'm just about to do a job interview, or, I'm an early years practitioner, I've got an Ofsted inspection coming. Our brains respond to these danger signals in the only way that we know how, which is by readying us to cope with actual physical danger. So a lot of the symptoms of psychological nerves, things like a dry mouth, things like a pounding heart, things like excess sweating. So that's our fight or flight system kicking in and responding to this psychological danger as if it's physical danger, even though that's actually not useful for us anymore. So this is what we're measuring when we look at it in young children. We know that, young children get this kind of distinction between fight or flight and rest or digest. We know from studies with adults that associates with these mental symptoms of stress that I was talking about as well, even though, as I say, in young children, we can't actually directly measure them, the mental symptoms. We only measure the physical symptoms. And then the other thing, just to link to what Kate was saying earlier about this idea of kind of individual differences, which is really, really key, is, as Kate was saying, it's a really, really important thing to understand why different children respond differently to different situations. And, when you're working with young children, it's absolutely crucial to do that. And one of the things that we're trying to look at is this idea of kind of environmental predictability. So can I predict from 1 minute to the next, what's going to be happening in my environment? So what I'm going to be seeing, what I'm going to be hearing, am I in a stable, consistent, predictable environment? Or am I in an unstable, inconsistent, unpredictable environment? And we think from kind of lots of research that this is one of the big factors that determine stress. So when I'm in an unpredictable environment, my stress levels go high, and we change how we pay attention to things and how we learn from things that can really have kind of long-term effects. So that's what we're trying to understand. What are the root causes that drive these differences in kind of long-term stress levels? What are the really early origins of those that are the types of things that early years practitioners are seeing as individual differences in children around about the time they start school.
Great. And just to expand on that, Sam, so we spoke a lot about the environment and how the environment influences our stress levels. But what about noise? So how does noise come into play here?
Yeah, so this is something that's really interesting. And we're going to be talking a lot for the rest of the podcast about kind of this idea of urban versus rural children and some of the differences we're seeing between urban and rural children and how that affects, educational practice. And this idea of noise goes right to the heart of it. So we've got some evidence. We published it from a actually earlier study funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, suggesting that kind of noise is one of the big factors that differs a lot between children growing up in urban and rural settings. And our data was actually suggesting quite directly that this idea of noise, even moments during the day when noise is greater, you get short-term increases in physiological stress in children. And loads of other studies have shown similar patterns with older children. A guy called Gary Evans at Cornell has done loads and loads of studies, really, really tight, kind of well-controlled studies. Things like they had one school that was exactly the same children learning in exactly the same physical setting with exactly the same teachers. And they looked at stress levels in children before and after an airport was built close by. So, 1 year, the children were just there was quiet, there were no airplanes flying overhead. Next year, exactly the same children, exactly the same settings, exactly the same schools, but they had aeroplanes flying overhead. And from those studies, we really get a strong idea of a causal relationship between kind of noise, particularly this idea of unpredictable noise, and stress levels in children. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking, as I say, kind of earlier in development, but we're very much finding the same findings that, noise affects stress and stress affects how children behave in educational settings.
Great. And anything you'd like to add to that, Kate? Because you're working with young children directly. And what have you observed in terms of their sensitivity to noise and their wider environments?
Well, I think Sam's right in what we're saying. It's around recognising those individual differences. And I suppose what's made me really curious about Sam's research and why I wanted to take part in the podcast today was that predominantly I've worked for most of my career in either rural or semi-rural locations. So children who are growing up effectively in the countryside. But more recently, I've now come to work in an inner London local authority, in an urban area. And just myself, I noticed the difference in terms of the sensory environment, in terms of how that busyness, that sometimes chaotic nature of the sensory environment, that unpredictable nature of the sensory environment in those very urban, busy areas. And so it's made me very curious in thinking about what the impact upon children's learning and development might be, but then also thinking about, as a practitioner, is there anything that I need to know that's going to influence my practice and means that that's going to shape perhaps the advice that I'm giving then to families or to early years practitioners around the best ways in which we can support children growing up in urban areas. I think it's really important for us to remember that there are different reasons why some families grow up in the countryside and why others grow up in the cities. And it's not necessarily a choice where perhaps we choose to bring up our children. And so some of the families that I work with, for example, they're sometimes living in temporary accommodation. They don't have the ability to move around. And so that might keep them then living in the cities. But for other families as well, they've got really good support networks in the places where they live. And so that's a positive choice for them to stay living in cities where they've got family, where they've got friends. And those support networks are just as important for supporting children's learning and development and their well-being too. So from my mind, the question is not so much around where the best place is for children to grow up, be it in the city or in the countryside, but it's about actually how can we use the research that Sam and his team are doing to then inform then our practice when we're supporting children growing up in urban areas.
So can I just come in on this? Because I think there's a couple of things that I think are really important, building on what you just said, Kate. So, I'm often in early years settings and, you're in something like a classroom and there's a group of children and there's an open window and there are children playing in the playground right outside. I just had this experience last week and, I was sitting there trying to communicate to a 4-year-old and there's a really, really loud noise happening, right next to the ear of the 4-year-old. And it's something I see a lot, just this idea that to me, as someone who thinks a lot about noise and how it affects children, it seems, very obvious that this is having a big effect, but to a lot of adults, it doesn't. And I think there are a couple of things that are really important here, which is as adults, our brains have got very, very good at coping in a noisy situation. But children's experience of noise is very different. And that's to do with things that we're just starting to understand about their brains and how about their brains affect kind of noise. So there's two things that in particular are important here. So one is this idea of predictability. So our brains are fundamentally prediction machines. The part of the brain under my forehead, the frontal cortex, is constantly generating predictions for what I'm going to see and what I'm going to hear next. And then the other parts of the brain are saying, okay, that is what I expected or what I didn't. Children obviously have got less previous experience. So they've got less previous experience of what they're going to see, what they're going to hear, and they've got kind of less general understanding of their situation. And as a result of that, we think that their brains are less good at making predictions. So what is a predictable setting to me is unpredictable to a young child. As I mentioned, one of the big drivers of stress is if I'm in an unpredictable situation, I go into fight or flight mode, and that changes how I pay attention to things and learn. So one of the things that's really important is the degree of predictability, the degree in which I'm going to be shocked by kind of loud noises and that type of thing is higher for a young children than an adult. So that's one thing that isn't intuitive. Like you wouldn't know that unless you knew, kind of the stuff that I've just been telling you. So that's one of the reasons I think it's really important to raise awareness about this. And there's another one as well, which is equally important, I think. And this is this concept of when I'm in a multi-talker environment. So most of the time you're in a classroom and you're talking to one person and my ears are hearing speech streams from other people having other conversations at the same time. Yeah. And basically all these different kind of sound waves are getting intermingled and they're kind of hitting this little flap of skin in my eardrum and making it vibrate. And my adult brain is incredibly practiced at doing a job that is really, really sensationally hard, which is teasing apart these intermingled sound waves. It's picking apart the sound waves that come from the voice of the person I'm talking to. It's selectively amplifying them. And it's selectively down-regulating the vibrations that are coming from the sound waves of the people whose voices I can hear, but I'm not paying attention to that one moment. It's this sensationally hard job that our brains do. But as adults, we're so good at it that we don't even realize what a hard job it is that we're doing. And again, we've got a lot of evidence now, really, really good quality evidence that children's brains find that speech and noise separation harder. So you can physically measure, how much their brain activity is affected by the noise that they're trying to pay attention to and the noise that they're trying to ignore. And you can show that it's more affected by the noise that they're trying to ignore than an adult's brain is in the same situation. So that's another thing that is not intuitive. Yeah, it's only from doing these types of neuroscience studies that we do that you can tell that children are more affected by being in a kind of multi-talker environment than adults are. So those are a couple of reasons, just to build on what Kate was saying about why this idea of noise is really, really important to do awareness raising about, because it's not intuitive. We're so practiced at dealing with noise that we don't realize what a sensational job our brains do of doing it. And we don't realize how much harder children's brains find to cope in exactly the same situation.
Thank you, Sam. And what I'm hearing here is just how important it is for young children for them to be in a learning setting, to be in a very controlled environment. And you're right, as adults, there's so much we take for granted that if you're neurotypical, you just do. You never question, you just see this is just normal. But yeah, it's fascinating to hear how the brain does so much in the background, which is often hugely complex, but we're actually unaware of. And it can take years for us as young children to develop that facility. We've talked a bit already on the programme. There are two key environments, urban environments and rural environments. And we all agree that we're not saying that either is superior to the other, but both have strengths and weaknesses. Can you expand a bit more on the different, the different facets of rural and urban environments in a child development setting, and perhaps especially what's the psychological impact of being in either environment if you're very young?
So I guess this is an area where I was particularly keen, actually coming on this podcast, to get Kate's thoughts on this. So we've done some research, which is, from a kind of basic science point of view, which is based on this idea that, when I'm in a high stress state, I've mentioned it in passing a couple of times, that when I'm in a high stress state, that affects how I pay attention to things and learn. And that involves both kind of strengths as well as weaknesses. So the weakness is when I'm in a high stress state, I find it harder to keep a train of thought in mind. Yeah, you probably all notice this. I certainly, obviously think about this all the time. So I notice it myself when I'm doing it. When I'm in a high stress state, you find it harder to say, okay, my goal is this. and I'm going to keep that goal in mind across a series of kind of interruptions and distractions. Yeah. When you're in a high stress state, you tend to be more driven by what's present in your environment. So if there's a loud noise going on, you're more likely to reorient your attention to that loud noise when you're in a high stress state. We call it kind of vigilant. And again, this used to be adaptive. My fight or flight state used to be times when I was actually in physical danger. So it's an advantage to me to be reorienting to whenever there's movement happening or there's noises happening or that type of thing when I'm in a danger situation to when I'm not. So, but there's also ways in which stress influences learning that are more about things like kind of fast learning. So when I'm in a high stress state, I'm better at fast learning. So I can present one piece of information kind of once, and I'm more likely to remember that later if that information was presented to me when I'm in a high stress state compared to when I'm in a low stress state. So at the moment, most of our kind of educational practice is really geared around encouraging children to sit still, encouraging children to concentrate for long periods of time, which is really based around kind of playing to the weaknesses, the things that high stress children find harder. So one of the things I'm really interested to explore is, okay, but there are also things that they do better when they're in a high stress state. What about changing how we educate children, how we interact with them, that's about playing to their learning strengths? So how can we understand how high stress city kids are different, and how can we adapt how we teach them in order to play to their strengths rather than what we're doing at the moment, which is playing to their weaknesses? So that's an idea. I don't know, that it's very well developed as an idea, and I'm really keen just to think kind of what practically this can be doing in terms of, practical changes that we can make to educational settings. So I don't want to put you on a spot, Kate, but if you've got any thoughts on that, I'd be interested.
I do have some thoughts on that. So I suppose when we're thinking about understanding the sort of the sensory learning environment, we are trying to help early years practitioners and our families to kind of be almost like kind of sensory detectives in thinking about what is the sensory experience that the children are having around them, as well as engaging with this learning activity. Because sometimes the focus can be on how the child is responding to the task and not necessarily how they're responding to everything else that's going on around them that they're having to process. And we think about, I suppose, sometimes setting up that sensory learning environment in a way that becomes a very calm place that, as you say, is going to help people to feel calm. It's going to help the children to calm. The kind of idea that if you're in a calm state, that's going to support your attention better. But it sounds like from what you're saying, actually, we need to give some consideration to those sensory experiences that are not just going to help us to be calm, but also in that alert state so that we're ready to learn. And for the children that we work with, different sensory experiences can have different calming effects and different alerting effects. And I think it's about trying to understand those individual differences so we know then which kind of sensory environment that helps perhaps particular children, because it might be different for different individual children, those that are really going to prepare them to learn, not just in a calm way, but in an alert way, so they're ready to receive that learning and that information too.
Yeah, that's something I think about a lot with my own kids. I've got two East London high stress kids, and I often think about, when they're excited in a kind of like what we call a negative affect way, excited and upset. I often think it's easier to shift them onto excited in a positive affect, positively excited, laughing and that type of thing, rather than just trying to dampen it down. And naturally your instinct is to want to just dampen everything down, but it's often easier to shift, high excitement, negative affect onto something positive than it is just to kind of get rid of the excitement overall.
There's a high degree of complexity in terms of interactions between how a child develops and the different facets that influence, or the different elements that influence that. So we heard about perhaps how the educator, shall we call them, interact with the child, but different aspects to the environment. It's sensory elements, both in terms of noise, but perhaps in terms of the objects and the textures there. But in a learning environment, how does it influence learning, whether you're indoors or outdoors?
So we've actually been doing a study on that, led by Gemma Goldenberg with some ESRC funding, and Molly Atkinson, who was a knowledge exchange officer. We had a post part funded by the UEL and by Newham Learning, which is this group of, I think it's about up to 60 schools, many primary schools, very much in the Newham catchment area. And we got some Economic and Social Research Council funding to run a study where we literally took reception classrooms from an indoor setting to outdoor setting. So a lot of these children were from kind of city schools, so they didn't have a lot of green space. So a lot of the outdoor settings were, concrete playgrounds without a lot of leaves and trees around. But we wanted to be careful about keeping everything as closely matched as possible between the indoor classroom and the outdoor classroom. So there's a lot of evidence about things like forest schools, and they're quite messy evidence because it's not just the setting that changes, but it's the type of things that the kids are doing that changes as well. And often it's the type of kids that go there that are different as well. And we wanted to do a much more tightly controlled study where we kept what they're doing exactly the same, we kept the kids exactly the same, and we kept the physical space that they had to explore exactly the same. So we marked out exactly the same, floor space outdoors as indoors. And we were doing things that you don't normally do outdoors. So we were doing things like phonics classes outdoors and that type of things. And these kids were wearing these little kind of stress monitors and little microphones that I mentioned to you earlier. And the findings have come through really nicely. So one's just been accepted for publication and the others are just about to come out, that the noise levels were much lower outdoors for reasons that you'd expect, rather than kind of noise just bouncing off the walls. Noise just disappears off, up into the ceiling. So things like signal to noise ratios that I was talking about, how loud the voice of the person who's talking to me is relative to the background noise. Those are the types of things that are much better in an outdoor setting because I don't have other sound sources bouncing off the walls and coming back to my ears. And we also found effects on things like attention and pro-social behaviour that were very much strongest for the kids who were having the shortest attention pattern. So the greatest difficulties kind of sustaining attention to things indoors were the ones who showed the biggest effects outdoors. And similarly for pro-social behaviour and antisocial behaviour. So the children who were doing the most incidences of antisocial behaviour indoors were the ones who showed the biggest effect to outdoors. We think it's quite exciting, this idea of kind of outdoor learning for urban children. But yeah, just really interested to hear any thoughts you've got on that, Kate.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I think that sometimes we can think about the indoor and the outdoor learning spaces in different ways. So I think perhaps more traditionally, we think about the indoor learning space as being this place which is quite calm, quite nurturing. It's the place where more kind of formalized learning takes place. And just what we were saying earlier, it's this idea that children are going to be in this very, very calm state because that suits that kind of indoor space. And then we think about the outdoor environment as being the place that's for more physical play, more boisterous play. But it sounds like from what you're saying, Sam, perhaps your research is leading us to perhaps reimagine the way in which we use those spaces, that actually it's not just around us making that distinction between the different kinds of learning that might happen in those two different places, but for some of those perhaps more formalized learning activities might be better suited then to taking place in the outdoor space too, because that sensory environment is different. So I can definitely see a real world application there for the research you're describing.
Just specifically on phonics, that's one thing that I think is really important, that if you look at the research literature going back to the 70s, there's loads of research about things like how echoey a classroom is and how that affects children's phonics learning. Again, earliest classrooms are very often you want hard surfaces because you want it to be easy to clean, that type of stuff. So you get these very reverberant acoustic. And there's really tons of evidence, going back, as I say, 50 years, that more reverberant acoustic, children find it harder to learn the differences between different speech sounds when they're hearing them in a less kind of clean way. So yeah, that's the type of thing I think, quite excited about the potential for the future for that.
Just to come in and pick up on that, just thinking about the kind of the idea around phonics. So I was reflecting on sometimes when we go into early years settings, the early years spaces can be quite open plan. So sometimes you can have several different early years groups that are within the same space and they can be doing different kinds of activities with the adults that they're working with. And so sometimes you can see perhaps a smaller group of children that have come together to do something quieter, say, for example, a phonics activity, but then still around them, they've got other children who may be doing different kinds of activities. So then you've got that visual distraction, that visual stimuli, as well as the auditory distractions too. And so it's just being mindful, I think, all the time about when we're asking our children to come to those opportunities for learning, what's the sensory environment like around them and how that's going to impact then on their readiness to learn.
Okay, thank you. So just very briefly, because I know we need to come to the end of the show very shortly, but I've got a very brief question. And someone has invoked this term co-regulation. And very, very briefly, can you just expand a bit on the role of caregivers and co-regulation within this learning context?
Yeah, so this is something that, as I was saying, life as a young child there are lots of factors that kind of impact kind of on your stress. Yeah. So things are kind of unpredictable. It's much harder to predict what's going on. It's much more easy to get overwhelmed. It's much harder for your brain to make sense of what's happening in a given setting. And as Kate was saying, this is kind of challenging for a lot of children. But what the evidence for that's really, really strong is the best way to be protecting children against this is to be kind of very sensitive to their stress fluctuations and to have kind of caregivers that respond sensitively moment by moment. Yeah. So if I kind of have a peak in my stress, so this is something we've shown in a few different studies, the more kind of moment by moment the caregivers were responding to the peak in my stress by matching my stress state to the child, and the quicker the child calms down. So you're continually, as a parent, as a caregiver, you're continually adapting your own kind of levels of stress dependent on your child. And that process of matching their stress state is helping them to calm down in a moment. So this is something that we think is really, really important. And again, this is something I'm interested to talk to you about, Kate, because I'm actually doing some kind of events for kind of nurseries on this, because they're changing the student to staff ratio in early years settings. So, each staff member will have more children to look after. And, our research looking at how parents and child manage stress together is this idea, as I say, it's really this one-to-one matching that's really, really important. But obviously, if I'm, working in a childcare setting, I can't be doing that one-to-one matching for five different children at once when I'm looking after them. So yeah, just really interested in any thoughts you had on what the impacts on this are for children in more formal childcare settings.
Yeah, and absolutely. And particularly, I suppose, from the perspective that I'm coming from is thinking about children with special educational needs. For those children, we can see that there's a longer period of time where that co-regulation is needed, because they find that move from co-regulation to then developing self-regulation strategies to just be that bit more challenging. And so often we're finding ourselves, we are having conversations with early year settings about that need perhaps for that more kind of one-to-one time then with a key person, with a consistent adult as well. So coming back to what you were saying earlier about the importance of predictability not just within the sensory environment, but within the relationships as well that children develop with the key adults in their lives. So needing to have that close relationship with an adult where they can predict the way in which the adult's responding, and the adult then is able to be attuned to and adjust to the way in which the child is responding to. Really, really important for children's development of self-regulation skills. So again, a question mark there, I think, for how then we're able to work within the resources that our early years settings have in terms of their staffing to be able to set up those consistent relationships that we know are so important for children's learning and development.
What do you think for the listeners at home, especially those listeners who themselves may be parents or caregivers or community members? What are the key takeaway messages from your research, Sam, and your work, Kate?
I would say for me, it's around thinking about helping our families, but also then our earliest practitioners too, to just be really, really mindful of children's sensory experiences. So just keep that in mind. So when we're looking at perhaps different ways in which children might be responding emotionally or responding through their actions, through their behaviours in their early years settings, sometimes we could be thinking about, what maybe the triggers have been to that, if perhaps there's been an event in their learning, or perhaps maybe something that's happened within the friendships and within the peer groups, but always keeping in mind then the sensory environment too, and how children's regulation and how their responses may be impacted upon what's happening around them in a sensory way. So that'd be kind of been the first takeaway for me. But I think also it is this kind of rethinking around how we use the indoor and the outdoor spaces for different kinds of learning activities. So thinking about how perhaps the outdoor space doesn't have to be more traditionally for that kind of like physical, more boisterous play, but maybe a trip to a local park may well involve some of that play on the play equipment, but also could involve some quieter time, perhaps sharing books or a story, maybe a picnic or something with close friends and family members. So it's making sure we're doing different activities and using our indoor and outdoor spaces in different ways, and thinking about then how our children respond to the sensory world around them.
For me, I think I'd say exactly the same thing. I think what's really important for me is just understanding what we really haven't known for very long, which is just how different children's sensory experience of the world is to what it feels like to us. And it really is only recently from these neuroscience studies that I've been talking about, where we've been able to measure how children's brains are responding to different settings, that we've realized that, their experience of the world is really, really fundamentally different to ours. They find it that their brains are much slower, they're much more inefficient, and they're much, much more likely to get overwhelmed when they're in a complex and unpredictable setting. So we really, really need to be thinking about that. And as Kate was just saying, she just put it beautifully, understanding how that can then have knock-on impacts on other aspects of their behaviour.
Fantastic. So I've learned a huge amount. And I think the listeners have also learned a huge amount about the great role that the environment plays when they're in a learning setting, okay? And of course, there are lots of things outside of our control, but for me, it's been an eye-opener how actually the outdoor environment isn't just for swings and roundabouts and adventure playgrounds. It could be a really valuable learning environment. And that, although you might hear a lot of people managing the budgets for their schools thinking, great, we can now access all our classrooms. But anyway, no, we're not advocating that, of course, but it's just great to hear how often our preconceptions may often be flawed, okay? So thanks very much to Sam and Kate. And thank you all, everyone at home, for joining us and for listening to this podcast. So this podcast was recorded as part of University East London's Year of Science. So please visit uel.ac.uk/Year of Science for more information about our upcoming events. On our next episode, we will be exploring the fashion business and sustainability. Thanks very much to Sam and Kate once again. Really insightful, really revealing. Thank you all, and thank you for our listeners at home.